Good evening, TheoTrade. This is Corey Rosenblum, and you're watching the Theo Nightly Video for the 14th of February here in 2023. And we have the CPI. CPI is behind us, but the market, as we're seeing here, did nothing. In terms of the close, we were massively unchanged, really ending up the session. S&P was flat as could be. The Russell flat as could be, but the differences, and if you even call them differences, the Dow was off 0.5% to the downside. The Nasdaq was up 1%, or 0.5% to the upside, almost 1%. And on the CPI data, let's pull that right in here. Just from the spider chart, looking at the core CPI, that's our headline. Just go to the headline. CPI data a little bit hotter or higher than expected. And in terms of that, roughly speaking, 0.5 expectation was a little bit for a tiny increase, but the increase was 0.5. Month over month, of course, year over year, still inflation is a concern. That's a big deal. But what did it do to the market? Not much. Actually, I take it back. By the close of the session, not much. But in today's session, let's just take it one by one, market by market. On the initial, remember the CPI data was hotter, a little bit higher than expected. You'd think that would send the market much lower. And it did until the market came back up and then went back down and ended the session, again, roughly speaking, where the CPI data came out this morning. How about gold? Gold did something very similar. This is, of course, a 5-minute chart on each of these, comparing it from the CPI occurred. And what happened next? CPI takes gold market down, back up, back down, and then flat into the close. Crude, which is your oil, that's a market that is going to be susceptible and show us inflation, has been for a while. Crude went down on the number, back up, back down a little bit, and stayed flat. The bond market, and these are things we'll pick up on individually in tonight's video. The bond market went initially down, expect that. And if the Fed's going to raise rates, that's the issue. If CPI, or I should say inflation, if inflation is high, the Fed is going to raise rates. And we see the bond market take a downward action. If we flip this the other way, we'll look at TNX. From the announcement right here, the bond yields, TNX, went the opposite. They went to the upside. Remember, the stock market went down and eventually came and settled in the flat zone. So let's take this on the big picture. At issue is the S&P. Let's go over here to the bigger picture and make this into a 2-year chart. So let's start with what I like to call the inflation pain train. Inflation is a big driver of the general state of the economy and, of course, the stock market, to the extent, we'll keep it simple just for the brief video. If inflation goes up, that is generally bad or bearish for the consumer and for companies that have large debt, and anybody that has large debt for that matter. So if inflation goes up, stock prices and the economy tends to go down. But the Fed right behind that, and why that number was significant this morning, the Fed, to combat inflation, will raise interest rates. That's been the campaign. Will they go 0.75? Will they go 0.5? Now will they go 0.25 with the Fed funds rate? And that will go all the way up the yield curve. So as the inflation goes up, rates go up, and the bond market, which is the opposite of the rates bond, we'll call that bond prices, are going to go down. That's been the main idea for the bulk of 2022. To the extent that inflation is a problem, the Fed will raise rates and will have to raise them aggressively. And that's going to put downward bearish pressure, especially on stocks in the tech sector. That's your Nasdaq. And there is your QQQ, which is the tradable ETF for Nasdaq stocks. Some stocks have fared worse than others. Meta falling almost a full 75%. We saw other tech companies, Netflix, that did fall 75% from its 700. Remember when Netflix shares traded at roughly 700 before the turn of the new year? And that went all the way down to 150. Now we're back to 350. So that's a volatile ride for tech company, Netflix, and others along the way. Amazon being more retail. Nonetheless, it took the sell side activity down quite a bit from its 2021 peak. So that's the first thing. Inflation will be bearish for companies with heavy debt. The bond market, let's look at TLT, that's your bond market, to the extent that the Fed raises rates. In fact, let's do that the opposite. If the Fed raises rates, rates are going to go up. That's easy. If the Fed raises rates, rates go up. That's been the trajectory or the price trend of the yield market. Here is TNX, that's your 10-year Treasury note yield. 40 is 4%, which is where we are potentially headed at the moment. 30 is 3%, and we spent a lot of time under 2%, which was the level that got broken from resistance in early 2022. Rates or yields now are closer to that 4% level. Now we go the other direction. If the bond yields go up, ZN, the bond market, goes down. So if inflation is still a problem, and if inflation is creeping back to the upside, we may see the bond market continue, and that's the target. These are things we've been talking about, and I've been highlighting to you in prior videos. The down trajectory or the down price pathway, we've been talking about it, has been playing out the last few trading sessions, and that is going into the bond market as well, which is tradable ETF, TLT. Of course, you can look at IEF, and just naming a few of the stocks. IEF will be a little shorter term, 7 to 10-year Treasury bond. So that's the easy, if we call that easy, in terms of inflation up, yields up, bond prices down, stock prices, to the extent that they play into the mix, potentially down as well. So as we go forward in this week, we'll be watching some other news events taking place. Retail sales will be coming up. Of course, you can always check through these on your calendar here in thinkorswim. So we're looking at retail sales. That comes up tomorrow. What will they be? Previous, expected, and how the market reacts to them. In terms of pricing, the market is at the moment pricing a movement of about 36 points in the S&P, and for tomorrow's session, pricing in roughly 150. To keep a comparison before the CPI data, the S&P expected move for today's session, flat, was around 66 points, and the Nasdaq was just shy of 300. And that, although the range was there, in terms of the conclusion of the session, we can have that 60-point rally up and down, but not in terms of the close. And the Nasdaq itself, in terms of its range, did play, roughly speaking, not quite, but almost a 250 to 40 thereabout range from low to high. So CPI data was a catalyst, but in terms of the big picture, it did not move the market much from where it closed on Monday. So tomorrow will be retail sales. We'll have additional earnings from companies such as, we'll list our companies right here. In today's session, Coca-Cola had its earnings, and it was down a little bit, 1.5%. Exelon had earnings up 2%. And tomorrow's session, we're going to have Kraft Heinz Foods, KHC, Biogen, that will occur before the market opens. And a quick look while we are on the topic. 60% implied volatility, $1.70 up for Kraft. That's a good, solid company. And for Exelon, or I should say Biogen, BIIB, $11 up and down. After the close, we will see American International, that is AIG. AIG reports earnings after the bell, as does Cisco. So that's one we'll probably be discussing in TheoTrade and in any positioning in tomorrow's session and the day after. Other companies, Southern Company, and then we'll have, that's all the main stocks there in the S&P 100. Retail sales and other economic news after CPI. So continue watching, and while we're on the bond market, the dollar did have its movement. It was flat by today's session, but on an intraday basis, it had the same volatility in the opposite direction as the S&P and the stock market. That was up, down, up, and then flat by the close. Bond market is getting a rally which is playing into TLT to the downside. And we're seeing yields, TNX, to the upside. Watch these yields, bond prices, equities, any major earnings coming up, headline news, and always be careful and safe. This is Corey Rosenblum with tonight's Theo video update for February 14, 2023.